Well, I'd like to thank you for the chance, first of all, to do this project, and then secondly, to have a chance to brief it all with you at the end. I think we had well a real productive collaboration and learned a lot. So it's nice to wrap it up in this way. And I'll just mention, my name is here on the title slide, but this was really a collaboration between my group here at the University of Miami and a group that we've worked with a lot at the University of Girona, who and our main contact there is Nuno, Dr. Gracias, who's on the line with us today, and then also with White River Technologies, who we haven't worked with before, but I think we made a lot of um, good productive contacts with them during this project, and our contact there was Greg Schultz. He's actually on a flight back from he's on the plane right now, so couldn't join us, but helped put all this stuff together. So I just wanted to make sure that it's clear this was a team effort. Um, okay, so slide 2. The background to this project is it was in response to the March 2013 Statement of Need, and we began about a year later, about a year ago, in April of 2014. And the basic idea is that the current both wide area and detailed mapping methods for underwater military munitions are really, you know, based on acoustic or metal detection methods. And although there's been some efforts to use imagery, they tends to be just a qualitative tool at this point, or either that or something that a person really has to analyze manually by hand with a lot of labor. Our perspective is that there's no single technology that works best. We're not proposing that an optical approach is better or can replace these other techniques, but that they can make them more robust. They can add something, and the reason they can be valuable as a supplement to these other techniques is really due to their very high spatial resolution, um, at least one or two or even more orders of magnitude greater than some of these other techniques. So that's the basis for the reason that we think it can be a complementary tool. And I'll also say up front that the obstacles. Why hasn't this been done in the past? Well, it's true that imagery is not useful everywhere. In particular, um, uh, areas where there's very low visibility or perhaps buried, where objects are buried. But and that's true. But there are lots of places where imagery can be very useful. Basically, where anywhere objects are proud of the seabed, and where visibility is sufficient to be that you can get a reasonable picture. And some of these places, rocky seabeds, shallow water, are areas where there's high use by either recreational, say scuba divers, or fishing, and therefore they're important areas. There are also areas where if you need increased standoff from the bottom so as to not have collisions, that some of the other techniques may not work so well. So the areas where optics can work are important places. A second reason this hasn't been done very much in the past is that it's historically been hard to map large areas with imagery. I think that this problem has been largely overcome in the last 15 years with better sensors, better power, digital data acquisition, those sorts of things, and big, easy, fast computer storage. And I'll say that that's actually still happening, even year over year since the camera technology has improved immensely since in just the 2 years since we proposed this project. So that the pace of that is pretty exponential. And then finally, the manual analysis of these images is a bottleneck, and that's the one that we're really focusing on. That's the one that I think we have the largest um, place place to control improvement, and so that's what we've been focusing on. All right, so that's the background. Slide 3. So we had mapped out a sort of a roadmap of how we'd like to proceed and integrate optical imagery into a multimodal approach to addressing underwater military munitions. And that's shown in the gray box in this figure. Basically, there's two paths. One is directly incorporating imagery using a seabed classification algorithm that we have already in existence. That's the left-hand part of that box. And then the right-hand part of that box is a whole suite of improvements that we think we can make to the algorithm, basically by incorporating, different types of analysis on the imagery, extracting shape, features, size, and depth, roughness. So that's sort of the big picture, long-term vision of where we'd like to go. For this project, which was the seed project, just a one-year proof of concept, we sort of pulled out a subset of those objectives as a test. And so the three objectives we had specifically were, first of all, to use our existing algorithm, seabed classification algorithm, with no changes to it, and just see how well does it do, okay? Both for detecting and identifying munitions, and also for classifying bottom types. Those are the first two objectives. And then a third objective was to make, one of these several changes we had envisioned to the algorithm to see, does that improve anything? Is it worth going through this process of adding additional information, and then making those same evaluations? How well does it perform? So those are the broad objectives. And on the next slide 4, I sort of break this out a little, the approach to these a little bit. So for both objectives 1 and 2, they're very similar. It's just that one is focusing on the munitions and the other is focusing on more like habitat types. But for both of them, we used multiple data sets from different environments. We had an analyst, look at random points, drawn from the entire data set to identify what they were. And then also for rare classes, we manually added points. So in other words, if you randomly subset one of these image data sets, 95 or 98% of the points are likely to be not a target of interest, for example. So you need to add some additional points. Then we set aside some of these analyst-identified points to use for validation, and use the remainder of them to train our algorithm. Then we ran the algorithm on all of the images that we had picked from where we had picked ground truth points, and then did an accuracy assessment using this error matrix approach, which I'll describe in more detail. And then for objective 3 was basically the exact same thing, except that we modified the algorithm to include, first of all, compute seabed roughness, height map, and then to use features derived from that height map in addition to the color and texture features which the original algorithm uses. But then we did all the same steps as in objectives 1 and 2. And I'll just give a few more details on these steps in the next few slides. So slide 5 talks a little bit about the data sets. We had 3 main data sets. 2 of them were from Hawaii. The first one was taken from this Ordnance Reef site, which is off the west coast of Oahu. It was acquired by a diver in about 25 meters of water and used video imagery. I'll show you that data in just a second. Then the Miami data set was the one that we collected specifically for this project. Here we used a number of inert targets, that just to see how well could we identify a wide variety of objects. I'll show you those in a minute. And we used several different cameras so that we'd have a data set where we could assess things like how important is the spatial resolution, for the classification. And we collected this data over 3 different bottom types, sand, seagrass, and coral reef. I'll show you that in a minute. And then finally, we exploited this data set from the HUMA project, Hawaii Undersea Military Munitions Assessment, which is also done south of Pearl Harbor there. And this is in much deeper water, It used a towed camera and was an already existing data set that we could exploit. The next slide, slide 6, shows the Ordnance Reef data set. So this was just a single test site, which was about 20 by 20 meters, a little bit larger than that. And it was video data collected by a scuba diver, and we processed it to make a mosaic of the entire area. So it was really like one giant image that we processed as a whole. And this image just shows you some examples of the level of detail that you can get, and you can clearly see some of these. Let me see if my pointer works. Yeah, you can clearly see some of these shells, which are proud of the bottom here. So that's the Ordnance Reef data set. The Miami data set, which is the next slide. Here we just show you the various targets that we used. We had 16 inert targets, which were placed by a diver on the seabed. And the way we did this was we put them all down on the bottom, swam over them with the suite of cameras, did basically a pass over all the targets, and then we moved all the targets like a meter or so in one direction, and then repeated this process over and over and over again. So even though there's only 16 targets, we have many realizations of each target in each environment in order to be able to ensure that the results are not due to just viewing one particular image or whatever. And down at the bottom of this slide, you can see example images from the 3 habitats that we examined. Sand on the let's see here, sand over here on the left, and hard bottom reef here in the middle, and seagrass over on the right. So that's the Miami data set. And then the Humma data set was, again, like I said, acquired in deep water. This data used artificial lighting. They used strobe lights to provide light, because the depth here was about 500 to 550 meters. And you can see there's the types of targets that were visible in this data set. The Humma data set is thousands of images. We looked at a subset of those that were processed by that we worked on for a different paper, where we had gone through and looked at them manually and identified the targets. This is a paper we wrote with Chris Kelly and Jeff Carton and Mike Tomlinson, and in across all of those images that we looked at, it was completely sediment bottom. So there was no hard bottom in this data set. And yet it's interesting to note that all these objects were still not buried visible. They were done above the bottom. Okay. Now, slide 9. So what we did was this. What I want to show here are the types of classes that we used and how we subset them. So this is for the Miami data set. We identified 36 different seabed types. Okay, that's the first column here under all classes. And you can see the first 21 of them are naturally occurring seabed types. They're either substrate like sand or bare bottom, or they're benthic invertebrates like coral or sponges, or they're plants, seagrass, and then the latter set of categories from class 22 to 36 are the various target munitions that we used. So when we ran our classification scheme, we ran it first considering all 36 classes. But then we also thought that, it's also interesting to know, okay, how well can you tell, say, for example, just munitions versus anything else? And so that's why we had, we basically grouped these classes into, supersets. And that's what the second and third columns show. The second column shows basically a classification scheme that discriminates the munitions types from everything else. And then the third column, what I'm calling the binary classification scheme, is just any sort of munition, any of the various targets is class 2, and then anything that's not is background class 1. And in the full written report, we discuss all three of these. Just for the sake of time and simplicity in the presentation here, I'm going to focus on the first set, all classes, and then the binary set, just 2 classes. Likewise for the HUMA classes, this is slide 10. We did a similar thing. There weren't as many targets different types of targets identified, so there's only 8 total number of classes. Let me get my pointer. There's only eight total classes, and then but likewise when we group them, there's still 2 in the binary scheme, the background and then munitions. All right. Slide 11 shows an outline of the technique that was used for our classification scheme. So I'm calling this the Girona classifier. One of the students that worked on this project, we call him Shihab. His name's Shihabuddin, but we call him Shihab for short. He developed this as part of his PhD dissertation, and the steps are shown here on the left, sort of schematically. First, you start with image enhancement, then feature extraction, and then some processing, and then the classification steps at the bottom. The important point here actually is just that, let's say the innovative thing about what Shihab did here was he highly tunes the algorithm to match a particular data set. So in other words, it's not the results work very well across a wide variety of data sets, but you need a good training data set for every set that you're working on. It's not very portable in that sense, but the results were good. So that was our basis, what we started with. And on slide 12, I show you what we've added here. We're adding a new set of features. And how did we do this? Well, the top row shows a few example images that we collected in Miami here, these 4 images. And note how they're highly overlapping, right? You see the same objects in multiple sequential images. We use that, the overlap between those images, to develop a height map, basically using stereo image processing techniques. And then from the height map, we can derive features directly. And let me get my arrow here. Okay, so this blue target round here you can see showing up here in the height map. And then what I'm trying to illustrate here is we extract patches, small square patches, from across this entire image. And then for each of those patches, we derive these 2.5D features. These are detailed in the paper that Shihab wrote and also in the report. I won't give you the equations for all of them, but you can we describe them. And then also as a combination of the original images and the height map, we generate a mosaic ortho image of the area that was mapped. And then from this we derive the 2D features that I just described, the normal ones that are used in the existing algorithm. And then by combining these 2D and the 2.5D features, that's what we've done to modify, take the first step towards modifying our algorithm. Okay. Now, finally, the accuracy assessment. All right. So how do we do this? Well, first we generate a matrix of raw counts, which is the number of points. So for example here, the number of points that were identified by an analyst, that's the reference, as class 1, and the number that were identified off of the imagery, the classified imagery that's predicted as class 1, would go in this box here. And you'd fill out the matrix with counts. One way to calculate accuracy is to just sum up the number of counts on the diagonal divided by the total number of points. And we call that the overall accuracy, which in this case is 94% in this sort of hypothetical example. Overall accuracy is a pretty good first cut measure of how well the algorithm's doing. It gives you, a fraction of a percentage of the total number of points that are classified correctly. But we also use some additional measures that give a little bit more information, and these are called producer's accuracy and user's accuracy. These are calculated by normalizing the raw counts matrix in two different ways. The producer's accuracy normalizes all these values by the row sums, and the user's accuracy normalizes all these values by the column sums. And the reason to do this is to generate a quantitative assessment of the number of false positives and false negatives. Okay, producer's accuracy indicates the false negatives. So in other words, if you have a high producer's accuracy, you have few false negatives, and user's accuracy indicates false positives. So that's a pretty standard remote sensing technique. All right, now let's look at some results. This is starting on slide 14. So what I'm showing here is the overall accuracy for all of the data sets that we calculated. And when I was putting this together, I realized that I maybe didn't pick the greatest color scheme here because, red is actually good here. Okay, red, and the accuracy is shown over here in the legend. Red is 90 to 100% accurate. Orange is 80 to 90. Yellow is 50 to 80, and the blues are lower. Okay, so you can see, and then the numbers that I've shown in here are the actual values. Okay, so what have we shown here? Each row is a different data set. So you've got the Ordnance Reef ones here. There's a row discriminating them by how they were processed. All right, so this is Ordnance Reef processed with only the 2D features and with the 2.5D features. These are the different Miami data sets, okay, ordered by habitat type, reef, seagrass, and sand, and then by which camera was used, the 56 millimeter lens or the 24 millimeter lens, and then finally by whether they were processed with 2.5D data or just with 2D data. There's a few interesting things here. Okay, first of all, these three columns show the results when we do the overall accuracy on the data that was used to train the classifier. And then these three columns show, the results when we use independent data for validation. And you can see that in general, the values that were done with, when you classify the training data were higher than with the validation data. And that's very normal. That's to be expected. And then likewise, the three columns within each type, training or validation, show the accuracy when we're using, for example, all 36 of the Miami classes, or the 16 munitions versus one background, or the binary just two class scheme. And you can see that in general, accuracy increases as you use fewer numbers of classes. And that's also a standard, you'd see that typically in any sort of, image, whatever classification scheme, almost universally. But what's not, what was really interesting to me was that using the 2.5D features improved the overall accuracy relative to using just the 2D features. So, for example, if you look here at the Miami Reef data set using 24 or 56 millimeter imagery, the accuracy was, in the 70s% using just two classes, using just the 2D data, but it was in the mid-90s using the 2.5D data. And that pattern holds true, it holds true here in seagrass as well. You're increasing from, 70 to 90 or plus percent. And it was a consistent pattern. Again, this is just overall accuracy. What I want to show next are some details of the individual data sets to give you some more flavor for how this worked. So first, the Ordnance Reef data set. What I'm showing here are, on the left, the images in the grayscale images, the mosaic itself, and then these areas in yellow are areas that a person highlighted as a target. And then on the right are the areas in yellow are what was identified by the algorithm as a target. And you can see that there's really, although the edges are a little bit rougher, there's really good agreement both in terms of the area covered here and just the number of targets. The overall accuracy of this data set was 96% with using just the 2D data and 97 with the 2.5D data. So there wasn't much improvement using height with this data set, but that's because the results were very high to begin with. If we go to the Miami data set here now, this is where I'll show most of the results because we have the most number of experiments here. What I'm showing here on the left is the producer's accuracy matrix and the user's accuracy matrix. And what you see is along the main diagonal you have the high values in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 100, and then areas that are off axis are low. Okay, and that's indicating that mostly things were classified in the right classes. But you can use these matrices to see some interesting things. Like, for example, coral, class number 1, had relatively lower producer's accuracy and really high user's accuracy, which indicated that it was underclassified. In other words, there were some false negatives. There were some areas of coral that were not actually classified as coral. And conversely, you have an example like class 27 here. This one was very high producer's accuracy and lower user's accuracy, which indicates that it was overclassified. There were some false positives for that munitions class. Next slide. Now, this slide is just showing a technique that I'm going to use to summarize a lot of the data, a lot of the results in a short space, okay? And the technique is to just show the main diagonals of these matrices, right? Because even though there's information off axis here, what you really care about is what's going on the main axis. So I've taken the main diagonal and I'm going to place it in a column, all right? And for both producers and users accuracy. And I've discretized the scale here. So instead of a continuous scale from 0 to 100, I've broken it into these same, 90 to 100, 80 to 90%, 50 to 80%, so that hopefully it becomes, a little bit easier to digest lots of results quickly. And the next slide shows an example of this. This is slide 18. All right, what are we looking at here? This image here. So each of these columns is the main diagonal of either the producer's accuracy matrix or the user's accuracy matrix, okay? Each column is the main diagonal. And there's 6 columns here indicating the low resolution imagery and the high resolution imagery in the 3 seabed types, reef, sand, and seagrass, okay? That's how we get 6 columns. So the first column is reef at 24 millimeters. This is the producer's accuracy, and this is the user's accuracy. And this slide shows the results of the classifier operating on the training data. And what you can see is that the median accuracies were 83% and 71% for producers and users, respectively, which is really high for 36 classes, actually. That's a lot of classes to consider. And then the other thing that was interesting from this was that the high resolution data was in some cases better, some cases worse than the low resolution data. Resolution, it seems that what we got with the 24 millimeter camera was good enough, and we didn't improve much using the higher resolution data. Now on the next slide, slide 19, This is exactly the same format um, and showing the same, type of thing, except using the independent uh, validation data. And the thing to notice here is that generally the values were much lower um, when we used all 36 classes. Although there were some that were very high, like for example, sand. This is class 5 here is sand, and in the sand habitat, you got nearly perfect result. Likewise, sand and seagrass were high in the seagrass habitat. The munitions were a bit more mixed in terms of um, whether they were accurately identified by type. Remember, this is all classes. So each one of these rows is not just identifying, hey, this is a target versus a background pixel. We're trying to identify, one of those 16 munitions targets here. All right. So slide 20. Remember I talked about how we had different groupings of the classification scheme. We had in the Miami dataset, we had 36 classes all told, but then I had grouped them. What we're showing here is just the results of munitions versus seabed. All right, and again, this is a producer's accuracy and user's accuracy, and you can see the thing that we noted before is that the results improve when you use fewer classes. Almost all of these were above 80% here. So in fact, a lot of them were above 90%. So the binary classification scheme, which is basically detecting munitions, not necessarily identifying what type they are, was a lot more accurate than trying to identify them, and we were better than 80% in almost all the cases here. And this is with the validation data. And what we can tell from this, from the producer's accuracy and user's accuracy matrices, we can highlight the main discrepancy here, which is that there were false positive matches for munitions in the reef and seagrass sites. We can see that because here we had high values of producer's accuracy and low values of user's accuracy for both reef and seagrass, and that indicates false positives. And I can show you on the next slide, slide 21, this is a graphical example of that. Here in the top row we have reef, sand, and seagrass images, and in the bottom row they're grayscale versions of those images with red highlighting areas that were classified as munitions. And you can see that indeed everything that is a munition is classified as such, but then there's these false positive matches in the reef and in the seagrass imagery, but not really in the sand. And so this is qualitatively demonstrating what the error matrix results showed us in the last few slides. All right. Now we want to move on to the 2.5D results. Okay. So here I'm showing you an example of two of these orthomosaics that we processed 4 of these. I'm showing you 2 just because of space. On the left here is one from the seagrass site, and on the right is one from the reef site. And in the second row is the same sort of thing, grayscale version of the imagery with red pixels shown as the ones that were classified as munitions in both areas. Okay, and you can see just qualitatively looking at these images, there were many fewer false positive matches. There's virtually no pixels out here in the seagrass that were classified as munitions. And quantitatively, I can show you that using these same sort of error matrix images here. So, all right, let me describe this a little bit. The left group here are producer's accuracy. The right group are user's accuracy. Within each, there's the left-hand box is using only the 2D features, and the right-hand box is using the 2D and the 2.5D features. All right, and so the point, and then each column is one of these 4 mosaics. So there were 2 mosaics in the reef, 2 mosaics in the seagrass. So you can see that just by looking at the colors you have many more oranges and reds when you use the 2.5D data than when you use the 2D data. And, and in particular, the accuracy of identifying individual munitions types increased from, fairly poor, below 50%, to, in lots of cases, above 80% by using this additional data source. So that was an interesting and encouraging result. And then this here, the next slide, slide 24, is just another qualitative illustration of that. So on this left panel is the orthomosaic. On the right, or on the panel B, is the mosaic with munitions identified in red. And then I'm showing here in the cutout, slide E, just a detail. And then slides C and D are the same area classified using only the 2D method. And you can see there's many more false positives using only 2D than when you use the height map as well. Okay. Slide 25 is the same sort of results, but this is with the HUMA data set, all right? So in the top section of this slide, I'm showing all 8 classes, producer's accuracy, user's accuracy, and then using the training data and using the validation data. And you can see the same general pattern that was observed in the Miami data set, which is that the results using the training data were quite good, upwards of above 90% in a lot of cases. And then the results using the validation data were much lower. However, when you merge the classes into just a background and versus munitions, you get almost everywhere greater than 80% accuracy. The only discrepancy here is that you still have some low producer's accuracy for the munitions, and this indicates that the munitions are underclassified, which is the opposite of what we found in the Miami data set. In the Miami data set, we found lots of false positives where things that were background were classified as munitions, and in the HUMA data set, we found more false negatives, which was things that should have been classified as munitions were not. And if we look at the next slide, slide 26, I think you can get a feeling for what happened here in the HUMA data set. So here in the top row, you have 4 images from this HUMA data set. And again, the image itself is displayed in grayscale, and then areas that are classified as debris are this sort of darker red color, and areas that were classified as munitions are this lighter red color, okay? So you can see that what's happening is that things that are actually, well, you don't get areas out here in the sand that are classified incorrectly, but you do get areas that are on the munitions that are classified as debris, and that's where you're getting these false negative matches. But there are few to no false positives. All right, let's see. Okay, so let me just summarize all these results here. For objective 1 was to evaluate the potential for classifying underwater military munitions. And what we found here was that the existing 2D algorithm without any changes was able to identify munitions from the background, generally with 80% or greater accuracy. This was done in multiple sites, both shallow and deep, over sand, and then in shallow water over seagrass and reef. Interestingly, we found in the Miami data set, we had a problem with false positive matches. In the HUMA data set, I think largely because we had a lot of debris type classes to deal with, there were false negatives. For objective 2, which was basically the same thing, but to look at seabed classes, again, the major classes were well done. You could detect things like sand versus seagrass versus from each other with, again, 80% or better accuracy. This was even using the independent validation data. Coral, even at the species level, was often highly classified, or classified with high accuracy using the training data, but there were because there's unfortunately wasn't a lot of, well, let's put it this way, working in areas where there's really high coral cover is hard to get permission to do. So where we were able to work, we didn't have a lot of samples that we were able to select for independent validation data. But I think in general, the results you could say would be similar to the munitions, that the results would be lower using independent validation data. The seabed errors were sort of the opposite of what you observed with the munitions. Okay, so if you have lots of false positive matches with munitions, then you're going to have false negative matches for the seabed classes. That's really not a separate problem. That's the same problem. But then some of the seabed errors were due to the fuzzy nature of the boundaries between these classes. So for example, consider seagrass and sand and seagrass and sand. That's a continuum, okay, between 100% sand and 100% seagrass and some sort of mixture. And we, define these arbitrary boundaries, but it's really a continuum. And so some of the errors in the seabed classes are really due to what people call the seabed classes. And I have a nice backup slide showing that if anyone wants to discuss that topic further. But hopefully that's intuitive. And then finally, the third objective that we had for this project was to test this assumption, because that further improvements to the algorithm will improve results. And again, the way we tested this was by incorporating this height map and the 2.5D data set in the existing algorithm, or adding it to the existing algorithm. And what we saw was that this actually really improved results dramatically. We reduced the false positives in the Miami data set, increasing accuracy by 20 or 30% or more in some places. And most importantly, this was not just on the basic sort of binary scheme. It wasn't just improving the results of let's say, just identifying munitions versus non-munitions. It was in the results that discriminated munitions types from one another. So at the very detailed class level, this improvement was observed. So we conclude that there is a lot of potential for using these images, both for wide area surveys and for detailed surveys, for identifying munitions themselves as well as their surrounding environments. This automated classification algorithm has potential to operate at detailed levels, but in particular, when we include additional data sets, when we include this other type of data, the seabed roughness data, we get much better results than when we use only the imagery itself. And based on this improvement, we think that adding the other types of data to this general approach will continue to improve the results. Now, so that's the basic, that's how far we've gotten, with this project. And if we have a couple of minutes, I'd like to talk a little bit about where we see this going, transition plan for this. So I'm coming back to the original image, where the original outline for the project, where we had identified this box as the future direction we'd like to go, and then this box as a subset that we'd like to test for this project. And so I think that the goal of the seed project is really to reduce the risk of doing something bigger and more extensive. And I think that what we've shown here is that the promise is there, and in particular the benefits of adding additional types of data. This sort of step in incorporating optics and acoustics and magnetometers together, or incorporating measurements of height, are likely to be the most productive ways forward. So how do we see that happening? Well, one option, this is slide 32, one option is to begin to integrate imagery with these other data sets immediately. And the method to fuse these together is not necessarily obvious a priori. We were discussing this actually in preparation of this call, and I think the three of us, Nuno and Greg and I, had different ideas about how we might most productively fuse these together, like whether you join the data together and derive features from a combined data set, whether you derive the features from each type of data independently and then merge them together in a classification scheme, or whether you classify each one independently and then try to merge the products. And so I think that's a bit of an open question and one that we'd like to pursue. And I guess I'll also point out that there's a lot of opportunities to pursue this in concert with ongoing projects. For example, White River Technologies had this project down in Key West just a month or two ago, where they were collecting data with this ROV, and we asked them to put a few GoPro cameras on it, so that we could begin to collect a data set like this that could be the basis for moving forward. And that was something that they were able to do. They were going to the field anyway. They took some cameras, they stuck them on the ROV, and we have something to begin working with already with really no additional effort. Slide 33. So here, I'd like to point out, there's also room for improvement in just the image portion of this alone. And we showed that by what we did out of all of these ideas, what we've done so far was adding monocular stereo to the 2.5D features. But we think there's other room to extract different types of information from the features. For example, shape is something that we're not using. Shape for anthropogenic objects like munitions should be a really good descriptor, I think. Likewise, the scale, are things fractal in nature, should be a really good discriminator between something that's natural and not, I think. And so we'd like to add those to the classifier. And then finally, another idea here for improving just the imagery portion of this is to use different sorts of image sensors. So for example, here, these images down here are showing on the top, an image of a shipwreck that was collected with a forward-looking sonar that our colleagues in Girona have, and then likewise the same image collected using DSLR. And so I think that, and there's actually many more images of this type in the backup slides if we want to look at that. But the point is that I think if we use additional technologies for data collection, like structured light for the height and forward-looking sonar for the texture, that we may be able to extend these sort of image processing, image classification techniques into lower visibility environments, places where the images themselves might not work by themselves. And then finally, a new idea that popped up as we were preparing this presentation was the idea that the microbathymetry on its own is a useful product. we're collecting. It's basically, if you think of multi-beam bathymetry, but on a scale of millimeter size pixels instead of centimeter or decimeter size pixels. And I think that this kind of product, even though it's not necessarily it can inform classification tools through this path, but it could also be used for other uses like measuring, quantifying seabed roughness over large scales, these kind of things on its own. And but a research area that's needed in order to make that a realistic possibility is how to compute this over large enough scales. Right now, it's possible to do it. The tools exist to do it, over the scale of say tens or hundreds of images. Maybe a plot size of 40 or 50 meters on a side. But to make it useful, how do we grow this into getting a site that's a kilometer on a side or more? That's still yet to be determined. So, and then finally, there's a few slides that we wanted that were part of this presentation that we'll close with. One was the budget and the performers here. At the University of Miami, there was myself and postdoc Brooke Gintert. University of Toronto was Nuno Garcias, who's here on the call, and then our student Shihav, who did some of his PhD work on this project, and then from Greg Schultz from White River. And then there was some leveraged funding that we used. The HUMA dataset itself was extremely valuable and something we could never have gotten on our own, and so we're very grateful for that. Likewise, the Ordnance Reef dataset was something collected by NOAA that we were able to exploit. Gracias and Shihav received some funding to work on this from EU grants and the Spanish government. So it was very much a collaborative effort. And then finally, slide 36, our student wrote one paper describing the 2.5D data extraction and classification results, and then we're going to present another paper at the upcoming Oceans Conference this fall. So I think that's all I wanted to present. Hope I didn't run too long.
No, that was very good, Art. Very good.
Happy to take any of your questions.
Art, this is Mike Tooley. I have a couple questions just to give a sense for that 20, more or less 20 by 20 meter. I think you said you ended up doing 450 square meters. Miami data set. How big was that? In computer storage terms.
Oh, okay. Well, let me back up and to go over this I think here. Okay, so there are three data sets. The Ordnance Reef data set was the one that was about 25 meters on the side. Okay, that is probably 2 gigabytes of raw data because it's video, but then by the time we distill it down to a mosaic, it's much smaller. It's I don't know, 100 megabytes or something like that. The Miami data set, we collected a lot of imagery, and we didn't analyze all of it for this project, but it's there and could be exploited in the future. We collected several hundred gigabytes of imagery here because we were getting a few thousand images from each type of camera in each environment. So it's I forget exactly, but let's call it 250 gigabytes of raw data, maybe something like that. And then the HUMA data set is equally large. It's about 30,000 images. So it's maybe, but only one camera. So it's maybe I don't know, 100 gigs or something like that.
Okay, I was just trying to get a sense for moving this up to a wide area kind of thing. Obviously, at the small scale, you can handle the data without too much trouble. But, what does it look like at large scale? I had a second question, too. If and that is on the 2.5D data. How automated was that, and how much overlap did it require between images to do that successfully?
Yeah, good question. Well, the overlap is the overlap question is a little easier to answer. That you need. It's really a question of the number of views you have of a given object. So, and I think is it four or five is sort of the minimum number of views you have to have of a given object to extract this using the technique that we used, which is called structure from motion. And basically there you exploit having this kind of multiple view geometry. And so we specifically collected the Miami data to be able to do that. The HUMA dataset and the Ordnance Reef dataset was also collected with enough overlap to do this. The HUMA dataset, there they were as an objective trying not to have overlap between the images, so we weren't able to get to do the 2.5D data on that dataset. But let me point out one other thing, which is that there are other techniques here. So there's other techniques to get this. We used this technique called monocular stereo, or structure from motion, in this project. There's another way to do it, which is to use structured light, where basically you shine a laser pattern down on the seabed, and then use the where do those points intersect on the image to extract distance. And that technique you can do with less overlap, but you need additional, you need the laser hardware. So there's a bit of a trade-off, but it's multiple ways to get at the same type of data.
And how automated was?
Oh, how automated? It's very automated. It's very automated. It's very okay. It's very automated. There's sort of computer vision libraries out there that we used to do this, but it's also very computationally intensive. So it's automated, but it takes a long time to run, and you can get the libraries to do it, but it's not like a package that you can just buy and click, point and click and run it. We had to do a lot of integration and kind of building of an interface to make it work.
Okay, well, thank you.
Just as a follow-up, when you say, Steve, when you say computationally intensive, are you talking just in journalistic terms, day, week, month for a run?
Well, for the little mosaics we did here, it was one day maybe, But those strips are probably 10 meters long, or by 1 or something like that.
Okay.
So doing it again, like doing it on a small kind of plot scale, maybe up to 1,000 square meters, let's say, is something that we can run on a PC here in the lab in a reasonable amount of days. To do it on a much bigger scale, I think we certainly have a roadmap of how to do that, but it just requires scaling it up to more of a supercomputer kind of thing. And
right. Well, that or graphics card co-processing.
Yes, exactly.
A lot
right.
of other things that's literally low level right now. It's as basic as what you can get for the computational aspect.
Right. Correct.
Okay. Second follow-up. What, and this may not be an appropriate question, what's your minimum pixel count to do your recognition do you need?
Yeah. Okay. We were trying to get at that. That was one of the questions we were trying to get at with the high resolution and low resolution data, and so we're using a sliding window. That's, I think the smallest one we used was around 128 pixels on a side, and then the largest one we used was around 300, about double that, 360 pixels on a side. So you need, and you want the objects that you're trying to detect to more or less fill that kind of space, I think.
Okay.
So, is that
Yeah,
that's what you're
I knew
asking?
it would definitely have to be not a set unit because obviously things are in different sizes.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
All right, any other questions for Dr. Gleason? Okay, well, I guess this,
No.
Sorry?
Yes.
I said no.
Okay. All right, well, I guess this would conclude the outbrief for MR Project 2414. I guess if there's any final comments or questions for Dr. Gleason, please mention them now. Otherwise, we'll conclude and hop off the line here.
No, I got nothing. I appreciate the presentation. I may have some additional discussions to follow up later, but I have to have those with other folks who will talk to other folks, friends of friends, all that.
Okay. Well, happy to, follow this up anytime. Feel free to, offline contact me or whatever. I appreciate the chance to run over this with everybody. So thanks for your attention.